Take a look at the Sony ZV-1 for photography. Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. And in this video I'm gonna take a look at the Sony ZV-1 camera for photography. This camera is originally designed for vloggers and video content creators, but it's also a pretty good camera for photography, especially for travel photography. And here's a disclaimer, I have bought this Sony ZV-1 camera with my own money, and I originally bought this for video as my B cam, but lately I have also used it for photography. I took a trip to Malacca. It's a town south of Kuala Lumpur on the coast of Malaysia. It takes about 2.5 hours to get there by bus. And this ZV-1 was my only camera on that trip, and here are some things that I found out after using this camera on that 3-day trip to Malacca. I'm gonna start with some things that I really like, and the first thing that I like is the handling. The camera is just about the right size. If it was any smaller, then it would be awkward to handle. There's this little grip which makes it comfortable to hold the camera even with one hand, and you can of course customize all the buttons and the only dial to your liking, and the screen is fully articulating. So you can even take some selfies, very important. So all in all, the handling is very good. There is no mode dial, but I don't think it's a big deal. I don't think there's any need to jump between different exposure modes all the time. On a small sensor camera like this, the P mode handles most shooting situations just fine. And if you need a specific shutter speed to either freeze action or embrace the movement in your picture, then you can always use the shutter priority. But I think aperture priority and manual modes are strictly for some very specific situations. The reason being that you cannot really do much with the depth of field on a small sensor camera like this, and also it doesn't make any sense to use very high F numbers because they will only introduce diffraction, which will only make your pictures appear less sharp. And the second thing is the size. I already talked about the size, but I'm gonna mention it one more time. This camera is just about the right size, and I'm sure some Micro Four Thirds enthusiasts will point out that the smallest Micro Four Thirds cameras are not any bigger than this, but once you add your favorite lens to your Micro Four Thirds camera, it probably becomes bigger than this. And another thing is that this doesn't have to be any smaller than this. If this was much smaller than this, then the handling would be heavily compromised. So there's a limit how small a camera needs to be, really. The third thing that I really like is the superb zoom lens. The angle of view is equivalent to a 24 to 70 millimeter full frame lens, and the maximum aperture is relatively bright from f1.8 to f2.8. And you are right, there is not a whole lot of zoom range, but I think the relatively bright maximum aperture more than compensates that. And at least for my photography, this range is pretty much ideal and enough. This lens is pretty sharp too. Of course, it can't match the best high quality prime lenses, but still it offers plenty of detail, and I think it's a very good match with the 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor inside this camera. And another thing that I really like is the superb autofocus. Sony autofocus is probably, at the moment at least, the best there is. But that's not enough. It's so easy to use, and it's so easy to get a sharp, perfectly focused results every time. I don't think I have ever missed a picture because the autofocus was not quick enough or reliable enough for that particular situation. And then there's the image quality, which is excellent in my opinion. Of course, it's not comparable to something like full frame or APS-C, but it's still very good. The 1-inch sensor is roughly about half the size of a Micro Four Thirds sensor, and the high ISO performance, noise levels, and those things are about a stop behind Micro Four Thirds, which is not too bad. And if you shoot RAW, the files offer plenty of flexibility. You can easily recover highlights or shadows if necessary, unless the photo is severely over or underexposed. I have made prints from the Sony RX Mark IV pictures up to A3 size, and they look great. And this camera has very similar image quality than the RX 100 Mark IV. And another thing that I like, and it was also a small surprise, that the battery life is so decent, at least for photography. The battery is small, but during 2 days I shot about 350 pictures and I still had plenty of power left in the battery. And I probably could have easily shot another 50 or 100 pictures on the same battery. So it should easily last at least 1 day unless you shoot really a lot and if you turn the camera off whenever you are not using it. And then some things that I'm not too crazy about, and the first is lens related. This camera does not have a lens memory. Whenever I power the camera on, it defaults to the widest zoom setting. And that is all fine if it happens to be my favorite angle of view. But if my favorite angle of view is something else than the 24 equivalent, then every time I power the camera on, I have to find my favorite angle of view or zoom setting by moving the rocker switch around the shutter button. And I think it's a major downside, at least for me, because my favorite setting is not 24mm equivalent. Mine is something like 35-40mm equivalent, and it's always an extra step to try to find the correct angle of view by moving the rocker switch around the shutter button. Then there is another lens-related thing that I don't really like, and it is the electronic zoom. I so wish this camera had an option to move through the zoom range in steps, like for example from 24 to 35 to 50 and 70. For example, the Lumix LX100 has that feature, and I think it's a great feature, and it makes it so much faster and convenient to switch between different focal lengths. With this camera, if you want to use the same focal length you used before you powered the camera off, it can be really time consuming and slow to find the same exact focal length by moving the rocker switch back and forth until the zoom settles to that same focal length you had when you previously used the camera. And there's no viewfinder, and that is a downside, of course. It's not a deal breaker to me, and there is no room for viewfinder in this camera, but I think it's still a downside nonetheless, especially in some really bright conditions like bright sunlight or something similar. And another minor downside is the relatively slow startup time. It takes a couple of seconds for the camera to be ready, and while a couple of seconds is not that long, it feels really long when you really need to get that shot. And of course, you should always have your camera ready and powered on if you intend to take pictures, but it can't be prepared all the time. And those couple of seconds also seem to last forever, because I'm used to the Ricoh GR3, which has a very short power-up time. And another minor downside is the lack of weather sealing. Again, not a deal breaker, But if you look at this camera as a travel camera, some sort of weather sealing wouldn't hurt too much. And it would be nice to be able to shoot even if it starts to rain without worrying too much. And I have experienced that several times here in the tropics, because here it rains quite a lot, almost every day. But is this camera relevant anymore in 2023 if you consider how good phone cameras are? I think it is relevant because the ergonomics are superior to any phone camera, and I simply prefer a dedicated camera over a phone camera. So I guess it depends on the user. Some people like to use their phone camera for everything, and some people prefer a dedicated camera like this, and I'm one of those people who prefer a dedicated camera. I think this Sony ZV-1 is an excellent package for anyone looking for a zoom compact camera, for example for travel photography. It offers a lot even for an experienced shooter, a lot of features and possibilities if you just know what you're doing with your camera. So there you have it, my opinion on the Sony ZV-1 camera for photography. I hope this was helpful, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that if you don't live in Finland. Thank you for watching, and I'll definitely see you in the next video.